everyone, and welcome to the first solo episode of Curiosities in Psychology. So today we're going to be kind of walking on the boundary between philosophy and psychology as we discuss free will, or perhaps more so our illusion of free will and what makes us believe that we do or don't have it. And so within that, we'll also discuss decision making and how we make certain choices. So free will is the idea that we have free choice over our actions and the way we behave and the decisions that we make. So in other words, we're self-determined. So for example, our legal system is based on the assumption of free will. It would make it very complicated if it wasn't. And so basically we assume that people had the ability to choose whether to commit a crime or not, unless they have a mental disability severe enough to suggest that they weren't able to consciously make that choice for themselves. But for philosophers, free will is still an interesting one to debate, and same when it comes to psychology. So I can't really do this podcast without at least mentioning Benjamin Libert's study on free will. So at the time in the 1980s, this was a revolutionary study supposedly showing that free will doesn't exist, because at a neurological level, our brains make decisions before we're consciously aware of them. So Libert monitored participants' brain activity using something called an EEG, which he put onto their head, and then asked them to perform a task such as pressing a button when an image appeared on the screen. And so he asked the participants to note the moment when they were consciously aware of their decision to move. And so what Libert found was that around 300 milliseconds before the participants were consciously aware they were about to move, there was unconscious brain activity which was shown, and this was labelled the readiness potential. So the idea was that we don't actually have free will because our brains have made the decision before we're able to consciously decide for ourselves. However, this experiment had a lot of flaws, and these days it has pretty much been debunked. So it was debated that there could be, or that there is, a delay between the impulse to act and having to record that they were about to take action. And further, another set of researchers replicated Libert's studies, and they found that the readiness potential appeared even before an image was shown on the screen. So this suggested that the readiness potential might not be showing our decision to move, it might instead be something entirely different, such as us imagining activities rather than our decision to actually perform them. So Libert didn't really prove a great case for free will not existing, but it's still really interesting to consider the different types of influences that may suggest whether we do or don't have free will. And another way we can look at this is through our external decision making. So years ago, there was a study done across Europe which is looking at the percentage of people in each country who were willing to donate their organs or be organ donors after they died. They found in this study that some countries had almost 100% of people willing to donate, whereas other countries showed hardly any interest. And so they kind of argued that it doesn't make sense culturally because some countries which were quite similar, such as Sweden and Denmark in terms of culture, were on opposite sides. But what they found was that the difference was caused by the way the question was worded. So the countries which had the highest rate of organ donors had been sent an opt-out form, saying something like, tick the box if you don't want to participate in the organ donor program. So if they didn't check the box, they were automatically on the list to be organ donors. And the countries which had the lowest rate of organ donors had been sent an opt-in form. So this will say something such as tick the box if you do want to participate in the organ donor program. So people still had the exact same options available to them, but they were sort of unknowingly led down a preferred direction. So I think this is an interesting example in relation to free will because it shows that the way a question is worded or the way something is offered up to us can change our decisions quite drastically and quite easily. So even though we supposedly have free will over this situation, we're actually being guided down a very particular path. And to sum this up quite simply, basically people are really lazy, and even though we think we can do whatever we want, we will generally choose the easiest option in a range of different situations, even a decision as big as whether or not to donate your organs. So this idea of free will has constraints depending on how we're asked to do something or how much effort we have to put in to achieve it. So you can sort of think of free will like an analogy of a king making decisions. So the king thinks he is ultimately making the decision, but really has all these little advisors running around telling him what he should or shouldn't do. And that's sort of our experience of free will. So psychologically, we feel like we have agency and we feel like we have all these options, but there are many different things which can influence our decisions. And this can be internal, like what Libert was trying to demonstrate, but we also know that things such as genetics can play a part in ultimately our ability to do certain things or even the way we think about certain things too. And then there's our external influences like social pressures or us being influenced by authority figures. And there have been many studies to show how we're influenced by these types of things. But beyond that, something that's really interesting about the idea of free will is that we can manipulate ourselves to believe that what we're saying or doing is what we actually believe. So there's an American psychologist called Daniel Wagner, and he did this really interesting study which he wrote about in his book called The Illusion of Conscious Will, where he got a bunch of participants to sit at computers and they had to individually answer a bunch of questions on certain preferences. And so the questions were coming out quite quickly, and basically the computer had been yoked, which means it had been programmed so that the study was manipulated. So the participants thought they were answering questions how they wanted, but the computer was actually choosing different answers. Now, the really interesting part of this study was that afterwards, when the participants were questioned on their choices or their preferences, they still came up with reasons as to why they had chosen particular answers, even though they hadn't chosen those answers. So I find this such a fascinating study because it shows how easily our perception can be influenced and how we can have this illusion of free will even when we don't actually have it. So I want to end by saying in philosophy it can be quite fun to play around with this idea of free will or determinism and whether we do or don't have one or the other. But from a psychological perspective, having the belief that we do have free will or have control over a situation can actually play a pretty crucial role in promoting positive mental health. Because a lot of the time when people go to see a psychologist, whether that's because they're feeling depressed because of an external event, or they're feeling anxious about something that's happening now or in the future, whatever it is, often the root cause is because they feel like they don't have control over a situation. So instead, when individuals perceive themselves as having control over their actions and their choices, they experience greater autonomy and greater satisfaction. So this, in turn, positively affects their mental health and their overall well-being. So whether we do or don't have free will or not, I definitely don't think that it's a bad thing that we do generally believe we have autonomy over a situation. And hopefully this podcast has given you guys some interesting perspectives on the psychology of free will and on the way that we perceive it. So thanks for listening, guys. If you want to see more, head to my Instagram or TikTok pages, Curiosities in Psych, or check out Spotify or any of your favorite podcasting channels for more episodes. And I'll see you next week.